Just Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Yes, hello again, how are you? Welcome to episode 104, and this is the next in our occasional series looking at the popular pantomime titles, and this time it's Puss in Boots.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, in the last episode, we were celebrating pantomime in Woking at the UK Pantomime Association Awards for 2025. Don't worry if you missed that or any of the other previous episodes, because they are all still available. And if you have missed them, so far we've talked with celebrities and backstage team members, we've discussed panto with practitioners, academics, talked about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. So make sure you check them all out where you normally get your podcasts from, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss any future episodes. So as I mentioned, in this episode, we have the latest in our occasional series looking at the popular pantomime titles. And this time, I've been joined by writer, director and academic Dr. Robert Marsden. How are you, Rob?
I'm really well, thanks, Martin.
Good. And also with us is Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Curator of the National Database of Pantomime Performance, and Founder and Coordinator of National Panto Day, Simon Sladen. How are you?
I'm very well, Martin. It's wonderful to be back.
Well, listen, we're talking about a panto which is seldom produced these days, and that is Puss in Boots. And Simon, like many of these pantomime tales, they have a rich history in folklore, and the same names pop up, and Perrault is there again with this one.
Totally. 1697, that version of the tale gets published. And of course, Perrault was basing it on a story and a compilation of Italian folk tales called The Delightful Nights, which if we think about 1001 Nights, maybe that was the reason why that was there. That was published in 1534. But it is a tale that goes way, way back and that we can see around the world. Sometimes the central figure is not necessarily a puss in boots, but it might be a fox or a jackal or a monkey. But it is wherever we see it, in whatever time, in whatever period, a tale really, I suppose, about disguise, deception, about appearances not being all as they seem. But it's very complicated, I suppose, in essence, to stage, because you've got your normal mortals, but then you've got this very central figure of a cat. You've often got an ogre and lots of costume and transformation within there.
Yeah, and Rob, it's a classic rags to riches story in many ways. It has similarities to other pantos and some differences as well. Our principal boy is Colin, and it's a really interesting cast list, isn't it?
It is. You've got Colin, we've had Ralph in the past, we've got so many different variations on the theme. I think as well, going back to Simon's point around that tale of that era, I was fascinated in doing my research, because I've never directed this pantomime at all, but doing my research in relation to today, looking at that initial tale, and the whole point of that tale being around that time in that period of enlightenment, suddenly puts the individual, i.e. the principal boy, the individual character, and then Puss in Boots with this drive of individualism and so on in that initial story. So you can absolutely see how it's of its time in history. However, it suddenly opens up possibilities for characters, or characters that might not normally be in the original tale. We can suddenly find different elements. And I'm sure as we go to talk about different productions throughout this half hour, that we can see how some of those central characters have remained and others are added in the absence of those more traditional pantomime characters, such as the Dame in the original story. We can find our way through that in modern interpretations.
Obviously, the cat is the central character, usually played by a skin performer, very often crawling in the early days, not necessarily upright. You mentioned the Dame, and obviously the principal boy, Colin, and the goodies and baddies, Simon, are there. We mentioned the ogre, but there's a good fairy as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to when you look back at these histories, because actually in 1818, one of the most famous clowns ever to have lived, Joseph Grimaldi, played the fairy Grimalkin. But I wonder if this started a bit of a tradition or a bit of bad feeling or vibes around Puss in Boots as a title, because the show was absolutely hated by the audience. There was booing. Reports say that the audience audience was pulling up seats, teared up the curtain, and the management had to promise to cancel the run before a whole, I don't know, a whole awful thing would have happened with the theatre being pulled down. So yeah, there is the fairy, there is the notion of this family being the Miller family, and it's interesting thinking about the principal boy, Colin, a name that we also see in Mother Goose, being central to that. I think one of the things that's interesting about Puss in Boots is it does really help us cement the principal boy, the female principal boy, during the 1800s. Eliza Povey plays it in 1823 at Covent Garden. She is arguably one of the first female performers to really excel and help popularize that role. Madame Vestris does it in 1838. That's a really key production. That really cements everybody accepting and wanting and loving the principal boy. I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes you have a Queen of Catland, and maybe the most famous person to have played that was Gillian Lynne at the London Palladium in 1962. Of course, years before she became literally the Queen of Cats as choreographer for that wonderful musical. But I wondered if there was some pantomime magic within that. And of course, as you said, that the cat being really, really central to that. Maybe one of those other reasons is that such a skilled role. I mean, Charles Laurie, who was the big skin artist of the day in 1887, plays it in a production at Drury Lane with Herbert Campbell as the king. And often we see this big, interesting breadth of characters, this rags to riches tale where you do have the royal family, the king, the queen, the princess, and then you have the Millers, where that's a secondary comic, your comic and your principal boy. And those worlds, as with many pantomime tales, interweaving, interlocking all around this central plot point of the miller needing to find some clothes after having dunked himself into the river or a body of water, and then coming out dressed in these regal clothes and being mistaken as a prince.
Lots of other characters have been introduced as the panto and pantomime in general sort of developed and evolved. Colin might have two ugly sisters, for instance. There may be some brokers men type characters in there, once known as characters like Cackle and Crackle or Bubble and Squeak. And the Queen may have even had a sort of comedy maid as well. And this was all during that development, I think, of pantomime, introducing variety stars.
Yeah, and going back to that point that you were just talking about earlier, that element that's missing, the fairy character is often introduced. It's often the fairy that takes Puss from being on all fours into the standing heroic Puss that we see in those iconic images. So you insert those moments, as Marina talks about. You don't necessarily have to have a fairy to have a fairy tale, but in pantomime you need the magic. So how does that magic get introduced? Well, actually, we'll introduce those characters, and we'll introduce those roles. I mean, the Imagine Theatre one, was it 2019? It was just before the pandemic. Actually, you're finding those. Well, we will have, very much like Jack and the Beanstalk with Flesh Creep, you will have the hench person who's then on on Earth in the village doing the ogre's work, doing the giant's work. So you can introduce those elements within it. And I think going back to those elements are key.
Now, Simon, you mentioned the sort of tale and how it developed, and then Perrault took it on. And I think if Puss in Boots is staged as a pantomime now, or any time really in the last century, it's been pretty true to that story. And you hinted at the plot, but it's not a well-known story these days, is it?
No, and I hoped you weren't going to ask me to try and do the plot, because it is a bit bonkers. I think it's difficult. We did see some pockets where it became a bit more popular. I say a bit more. In 2013, both the Hackney Empire and Greenwich Theatre produced Puss in Boots. Robert's already talked about Belgrade Coventry's Imagine Theatre production in 2019, which actually the V&A, we recorded that for the National Video Archive of Performance as an example of excellence in pantomime, and that can be watched by people who want to come and see that at the museum. There were two other productions that year at the Fisher Theatre Bungay and Chipping Norton. But yeah, it's pretty solid and true to that tale of the miller befriends a cat, or a cat befriends him. When it puts on these magical boots, or the boots become magic, it can walk and talk, and they become best friends. And as I say, the miller son gets, well, depending on the way of the tale, but anyway, for whatever happens, he gets very wet, needs to put on some clothing which is regal in wear because he picks up the wrong clothing or some's just been thrown out. And then this tale of him as a marquis or sometimes as a member of royalty is there, and he falls in love with the princess. And of course, as we know, that's a tale of who is the person really. And then there's this wonderful final sequence where it looks like all's going wrong with an ogre or whatever the character is, but the cat outwits the ogre because the ogre can transform. And so often it is the cat that says, well, I bet you can't transform into a mouse. And he goes, well, of course I can do that. And I'll leave the listeners to imagine what happens next. Lots of squeaks and the ogre is no more. There is a version, interestingly, one of the only pantomimes that's ever been done in Germany, Der gestiefelte Kater, so not necessarily a puss there, but a tomcat, which was set partly with a Star Trek out of space sort of environment and setting, which was wonderful to think of that introduction to many German audiences as being this sort of space age version of Puss in Boots. But it is very trad in that way. Hackney Empire, when Susie McKenna did it in 2013, had this wonderful thing where the villain was bottling people, and in the end that's how the villain was sort of got their comeuppances, played by wonderful team of performers there, and Cat B actually being Puss in that. And of course sometimes it's confused or sometimes merged with Dick Whittington, this centrality of the cat. I do think that Shrek enabled that popularity of the character, but I still think it's one that isn't as well known narrative wise, and arguably that might be why it's not produced as much, as well as I think a pretty bad luck run of productions. There was that early 1881 I spoke of earlier. There was a 1915 production which of course, with the war going on, had very bad business, and the cast were asked to take half their salary. Didn't go down too well. All the cast did and one member didn't, but then it picked up about Easter and they all got paid their full amount in the end. So there are a few bits in history where it hasn't been, and it's funny because we don't think about it with Dick Whittington and the cat, but cats are not always lucky, or are lucky, depending on how people see and feel about them. It's wonderful to think about all those superstitions that take place, and maybe that's also got something to do with it.
The title is often picked when you've got longevity in a venue. So if you think about Greenwich and Andrew Pollard at the time, and if you think about the Coventry, Imagine, Belgrade with Ian, you are then in a situation where the audience trusts your product and trust what you're going to do with the title. And therefore it suddenly opens up possibilities due to longevity.
I mean, it was first seen at Covent Garden in 1817, and that wasn't a real success either. And I mean, it's been tweaked several times in history. And I think one of the other problems with it, it doesn't really have a clear moral, does it, Rob? In that anything that is gained in this is done through trickery. It's a questionable morality in a way, isn't it?
It is. Millie Taylor picks up on this around this title that doesn't necessarily have that strong, clear direction. The cat is morally ambiguous. You could therefore say that the character, Colin, is also therefore morally ambiguous as well, in depending on the script and how that moves along. So cat is duplicitous, there's disguise, there's deception, as we've talked about. So interestingly, that we go back to the Perrault version, because that is in relation to the ogre and the other in that Jack and the Beanstalk style. When you look at something like the later iterations of the story with the Brothers Grimm, which is more around a sorcerer, then that's even got a deeper moral ambiguity, because whilst there is magic in there through the sorcerer, you're then actually talking about a potential mortal character. And so the cat is talking around, I will gain riches. But again, goes back to this point of the power of the individual, this power of coming away from kind of from it's a pivot point in society. So interestingly, to have the ogre and the defeat of the ogre, that really, really strong drive, which is what the Imagine theatre production did all those years ago, is really key. The Above the Stag production, the ogre is directly gaining revenge on the citizens. So you can say that the cat, it's about survival. It's about that individual, that notion of survival. How do I survive against the oppressor? So that idea of good versus evil, it's really key, but it's morally ambiguous. So you've got to think, as a writer, as a practitioner, as a director, how am I going to land this story to an audience audience? What is the moral takeaway? Where is the moral strand through this? So that's why the setup of the ogre and the terror that they can often inflict on the village in the same way as the giant can often be the way into telling the story. And then, and linking back to what we were talking about earlier, because there isn't necessarily that level of expectation and it doesn't come with a huge amount of baggage, writers can be freer in terms of how they might want to then interpret that story, that we're not necessarily, that there isn't that tick box, oh, I didn't see this, I didn't see that, because there isn't necessarily that expectation. So it's making sure that whatever route you go along, that the moral is pulled out in such a way that the cat's actions are proportionate to the threat.
I'm thinking about other productions that I've seen, and earlier on I was talking about how Colin gets splashed in the water, but often actually it's more the case that the cat has told him to bathe in the water, and then he causes attention, doesn't he, by saying, oh, he's drowning, and has lost all his fine clothes, and then he is costumed, if you like, by the royal party who are passing. And so again, in that sense of morality, it's an interesting one where you draw the line or where you fall on. You know, who is being exploited or who is doing the exploiting there, and that decision that's made not to come clean, or how you build that up is a really interesting one.
Yeah, now, Simon, we've talked about the various characters that can come and go, and we've talked about the various interpretations of how the tale is told, perhaps more so than the average pantomime. It's been known, even in the 1900s, it was known as everything from Harlequin and the Miller's Son to Harlequin and the Fairy of the Golden Palms. Do you think it's been tweaked and messed about with so much just because the story isn't as clear and simple as some of the others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives you that opportunity, doesn't it, to almost do whatever you like, because there isn't the strength of linear narrative that would be known from titles that maybe have had the Ladybird book or a Disney adaptation and those shorter, more succincter plot points. It's interesting that there have been lots of different titles. You mentioned a few of them, Martin, also The Marquis of Carabas or Puss in Boots. I think it's just one of those ones that it would be nice to see a resurgence of it. But I do think one of the challenges is that central role of the cat, that, you know, being in one of those historic costumes back in the day was absolutely awful, let alone for your knees and all the rest of it. But the heat, you know, a lot of those performers died early because of the labor and the perils of that role. Today, of course, with costuming, we've actually taken a few steps forward, and we could easily very acceptedly by audiences have a cat in maybe a baseball cap with some cat ears and a tail and wearing almost humanoid clothes. And I think maybe that is something that we might see a bit more of. But I think it does, just like that German production. Why not have it set in a bit of out of space and have characters from Star Trek and the other ones coming in? But then it's about how much does your audience know already going in to be able to enjoy those diversions from the plot, or how much actually can you convince your trustees or your venue that it's going to sell, people will recognize the title on the poster, or however you do that artwork, and they're not going to think, oh, it was Dick Whittington last year or 2 years ago, we did what, you know, why do we want to see that? Or, oh, what is that story? I'm not really sure of it. And I know that many productions have experienced that, particularly in further down the line in rehearsals, where even cast members have gone, oh, why is this happening here? It's a bit confusion. How do I actually resolve this? So yeah, it's a tough one, but the more that it would be produced, of course, the more confidence there would be. And we are seeing now with Goldilocks, with Robin Hood this year coming, actually, you know, many more producers going to that wider portfolio of titles. And maybe this will be one of the next ones.
Yeah, I think, Robbie, it really started to die away sort of 1980s, 90s, really. And it's interesting. We always talk about the success of pantomimes having a resurgence, if you like, because of Disney movies, and we can give so many examples of that. And yet, when Shrek 2 came out and Puss in Boots was introduced as a character there, it didn't have the same effect, really. And I think that's probably because the character was in Shrek, but the story of Puss in Boots wasn't really told, was it?
That's right. That's not at the foreground. So you start to get these little ripples, and then after the Puss in Boots and the Antonio Banderas, you get all these voiced animation, you start to get all these little ripples that we were talking about earlier around kind of 2013 onwards. So, but it doesn't have that drive. In Shrek, yes, it's part of the plot, but it doesn't drive the plot. It's not the titular character.
So do you think it has a future, Rob? And if it has a future, do we have to sort of simplify the story more, perhaps?
I do, and I do think it has a future. Whether it will start to climb the ranks, as we started to see with some other titles over the years, in terms of like Peter Pan starting to climb the ranks, has yet to be seen. But it does have a future, and it also goes back to what's left out. Going back to the Brothers Grimm version, that actually the cat is motivated because actually the miller's son says that actually I'll kill you. So actually the cat is about survival as much as the miller's son in that moment. So it's really incumbent on us to look at those original stories, have a look at the pantomime structure, having those familiar archetypes back in, as we talked about earlier. Where do you find the dame in that character? Where do you find that mother-son relationship potentially, i.e. parent-child? I don't go as far as buying this idea that the cat somehow replaces the mother figure and all of that. But there are elements in which the pantomime can actually support the telling of the story. So it's really incumbent on writers to think differently about this one, but also I think that gives us just as much opportunity. But yeah, whether it becomes a staple in the top five, I'm unsure about, but let's see.
Simon, it has a lot of similarities, I guess, to other pantomimes as well. We've talked about, obviously, the link with Dick Whittington through the cat. The ogre likens it to Jack and the Beanstalk. And there are one or two things that probably have to be changed anyway. I mean, in some versions, the cat actually eats the ogre at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. The eats the ogre as the mouse. It's funny, really reflecting on some of the biggest changes that have been made. Probably thinking about Susie McKenna's Hackney Empire production, where the Queen was evil and there was a villain in it as well. So that was a wonderful nuance there. And actually, the princess was a bit of a brat. She played it completely like a spoiled brat daughter. And so again, we're seeing a big change in many pantomimes, not pushing on a love story. And of course, that's one of the areas of deception. That's why they fall in love in many a story. And there's an option there to have a look at that. But I think it's a really interesting one to think about that. And I do wonder as well, we have seen Goldilocks, Robin Hood with a resurgence. Part of that is the Palladium's role to really amplify and to take that risk and say, hey, look, this is a show that works. I think we've only had two Puss in Boots at the Palladium, 1949 and 1969. The 62, 49 with Tommy Trinder, 62 with Dick Emery, Frankie Vaughan, that one with Gillian Lynn, as I mentioned. So who knows? We haven't heard what the Palladium Panto is this year. I don't think it's going to be Puss in Boots, but you never know. But that can throw weight behind a show and a bit more confidence elsewhere as well.
Yeah, well, given all the various characters that you can add to this, it might be a good one for the Palladium. Incidentally, I mean, people might be surprised here. You mentioned Dick Emery. I think he played the cat.
Yeah, and of course our wonderful, wonderful Nigel Ellicott, who sadly said goodbye to as he passed away last year. But one of his first roles was the cat in Puss in Boots as well. And I do think with this centrality of the animal, we've seen many, many more walking, talking comedy cows in Jack and the Beanstalk. That character has such great potential now with this next iteration of panto and the no longer necessity of have to have a love romance throughout it, that I think there's really good examples. And of course, as we've seen many shows thinking about what social media in particular with Mother Goose, for example, and that notion of the appearance, and she wants to change. I wonder if there's some playful thing there about how somebody appears and is taken as, like, back in the day, the robes, the royal robes, you're seen as that, but with filters and stuff. People are playing at that with versions of Mother Goose. And this seems to me, with shoes, with clothing being so vital, another area which could make it incredibly contemporary or give it a bit of a spin.
Rob, as a director, how exciting is it for you if you were given this title, with a brand new script? It's really exciting for a director to work with something completely different, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the reasons I jumped at the chance of working on Robin Hood last year, because I hadn't done Robin Hood before at all. So I was really keen to work on that. And for me, there are real opportunities for those moments of spectacle in Puss in Boots. We talked about that transformation. The ogre can transform into large creatures, small creatures. You've got those potential moments, as we can see through the production history of this, with coaches and horses and transformations in the water and so on. So you have automatically, in the same way that, for example, your Jack and the Beanstalk has, you have real wow moments as a director, those visual wow moments through the transformation possibilities.
And what about the animated Shrek movies with the character Puss in Boots? Is there an opportunity here, Simon, to actually do something with digital sets? Because, there are lots of incredible scene changes and, those sort of spectacular moments that, might be even more fantastic if they had digital sets behind them.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of can do anything, can't you? Think of all that the ogre could transform into, or the very way that Puss gets their magic given to them. I remember at Greenwich they had a wonderful sort of almost magical going to Catlandy style sequence as well. So I think there absolutely are, and also ways I suppose to bring the world to life. I know we know Imagine Theatre have been doing fantastic work over the last few seasons in evolving and developing that process, from simple things like having the windmill turning whilst you're doing that scene in front of it, if you keep with that setting, to full on opportunities which really could be explored, particularly in that role of transformation and particularly in that area of deception. If you're going to go down that road of filters on mobile phones, or of not being who you seem, which of course is an Emperor's New Clothes style narrative and moral as well, isn't it? You could see great options for that. But I do think that is an incredibly exciting aspect to think about, how that notion of disguise deception is also aspects of innovative design that could really, really take it to new places, particularly thinking about all those wonderful settings, the windmill and whatever the body of water is, whether it is a lake or a river, whether you're underwater, whether you're in the air going to Catland. Airte designed one of the sets for Puss in Boots, absolutely glamorous, amazing. So I think the possibilities are sort of endless, and I think it's absolutely ripe for another big production to give it that. Well, we're not quite at 9 lives, but whatever one we are, to help it bring it back into the public consciousness and really, support and champion those titles.
That's the question, though, isn't it, Rob? Finally, that public consciousness, because at the end of the day, we're talking about pantomime as a form of entertainment and an art form, but it's also a business. And for any producer to take any sort of risk with a title, it's a difficult time financially to be doing that sort of thing. So maybe it is, the in-house rep theatres that might do it, or a company that is established, as you mentioned, with the Belgrade, where everybody comes back every year because they're comfortable with the production. Is that the only way that this can survive, do you think?
I don't think it's the only way, but I think it is a way. I think, Chipping Norton in-house there. We've talked about the Contra Belgrade with Imagine and so on. So where you have that, you have a different way of making theatre through with a lot of that's kind of subsidised route. And I think, linking back to what Simon was saying, having then the commercial confidence of a major player such as the Palladium, you can kind of bridge those elements. You've also got past productions which above the Stag in relation to LGBTQ plus productions, and it's also a major staple of amateur and community pantomimes, partly because of the amount of characters that you can have with the sisters of Colin, the brokers, as we were talking about earlier, dames, kings, queens. You can have a huge array of parts, and you can see why it's quite a staple in the amateur circuit as well.
Well, let's hope it does survive. Thank you, both of you, Simon Sladen and Rob Marsden. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Martin.
And that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the series where you normally get your podcast from. And make sure you join me for the next episode, when I'll be chatting to the comedian, actor, television presenter and panto legend, Joe Pasquale. That's next time in episode 105.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.